When you think of finality, it's easy to fall into the trap of assuming it means the end of something. I mean, the word final is there, right? We've mostly seen finality as the end game for Star Rail's story, the proverbial final boss as it were. Because of this, those that follow Terminus like the Stellaron Hunters as well as the path itself has unsurprisingly been painted as bad guys. But with the recent bits of lore we learn from the members of the Creed Exarchy, the path of finality might hold a different meaning altogether. One that doesn't really paint them as the proverbial villains, but instead as something that can inspire hope. And that's what we'll be discussing in this video, an alternative view on the philosophy of the path of finality. Before we do that though, if you want to see more Honkai Star Rail content, do consider subscribing to the channel. For a long time, most of what we know about finality comes from rather disconnected sources, simply because finality wasn't a hot topic in the main story. Our source of information for the longest time were two factions that we barely know anything about, and the leader of the Stellaron Hunters, Elery, who wasn't even explicitly confirmed to be a follower in the past. That's pretty much it. Through the introduction of the new game mode, however, we meet a rather interesting character, Elery, who is one of the members of the Creed Exarchy. Now, Elery doesn't really say much, but the little that she does say actually provides a bit of insight into why her faction chose to follow Terminus. As I mentioned in the intro, finality has always been seen as a negative thing due to the nature of something being final. It evokes thoughts of something forcibly ending or finishing abruptly, so naturally, we might not consider that as a good thing. It makes one think that an outside and uncontrollable force is trying to end the story before it truly plays out, and that finality means the end of everything. But according to Elegy, this isn't the case. While finality can represent the end of many things, the most important distinction that she makes is that finality doesn't mean the end of everything. The difference, at least according to her, is that finality can also represent the beginning of the next thing, the next cycle of existence, and in doing so, it becomes the point of origin of everything. While we can't be sure that finality does represent this, because as you might know, Elegy might be a little bit biased here, it does remind me of a rather interesting concept related to our own universe. Because Elegy claims that all things will originate from the end that finality brings and will then move on to the next finality, it brings about the idea of the Big Bang being a repeated occurrence. The universe born from an infinitely hot point of existence that expands and later contracts, and then this process repeating itself. In this analogy, finality is both the endpoint of one universe, but also the starting point of the next one, and that in itself doesn't really sound like a bad thing. It just sounds like the natural progression of the universe itself. She also compares finality to the many other paths, and states that finality is what will cause preservation's ember to rupture, the immortality of abundance to wither, and even the dark sun to turn to ash. As you know, not all paths are created equal, and with what we've seen through Acheron's own story, nihility is one of those rather depressing ones. The Dark Sun clearly refers to nihility, that espouses the pointlessness of the universe. But if finality can bring about even the end of nihility itself, doesn't that make it sound a little bit more hopeful? If you were an unfortunate and unwilling follower of nihility, understanding and perhaps following finality meant that there is something beyond that pointlessness. A point or purpose for all the suffering, even if that point just leads to the birth of another existence. This might make those lost in the despair of nihility have some semblance of hope. To know that beyond the pointlessness of existence, there is some final endpoint, and one that leads to the birth of something potentially greater. We can kinda see this idea even among the Stellaron Hunters who follow Elery, a follower of Terminus themselves. The life of each of their members is arguably pretty sad, dismal, and depressing. Firefly was artificially created along with a disease that prevents her from having a long life. Blade was made functionally immortal after trying to save his friend. Kafka feels nothing towards those closest to her, and Silverwolf lost all her accounts. Despite that, they each follow Elery because through finality, their lives might have meaning even at the very end. Blade might get the death he so wishes for, Firefly may get a longer life to spend with the Trailblazer, Kafka may finally understand fear and happiness, and Silverwolf might finally get all 60 of her accounts back. Finality, in its own way, each gives them hope by providing an ending that they might be willing to accept. My point is that these hardcore criminals follow Finality not because of fear or ambition, but rather they hold out hope that their lives can get better and that even despite their sins, they may have purpose yet to be fulfilled. This might be the true meaning behind Finality, as it might really hold two different meanings. One side represents the end of something, but the other side represents a hopeful beginning of something else. All things must inevitably end, but from that ending, something new and greater might rise from the ashes. This also ties in pretty well with a long-standing idea I've had in that the story we are experiencing within Star Rail is a repeating or looping story. Existence is on a loop, and when one version of the story ends, another begins. Overall, if this idea is to be believed, it means that Finality does have positive qualities and represents the cycle of life and death rather than just the end of everything. Most of the paths and aeons also have similar patterns, and it's not always obvious which path is considered good or bad. And like most of these, this seems to apply to Finality as well. That said, you have to understand that most of this comes from Elery, an individual who is clearly biased given they believe Terminus is a god worth revering. She might claim Terminus is the starting point of the next universe, but perhaps that's nothing more than wishful thinking. Though admittedly, the question she wishes to ask Terminus does align with the idea that Terminus is itself a contradiction. All I'm saying is that we have to take her claims with a grain of salt, and Terminus may still end up being the big bad guy we have expected them to be when we finally reach the end of the story. But who knows, maybe the story throws a curveball halfway and the universe ends up getting resetted anyways. Or maybe Terminus has a completely other goal altogether. With that though, I'll bring the video to a close. As a reminder, this is just an alternative take on Finality, and it's not a definitive proof or anything that it functions in this way. Star Rail's lore is difficult to predict, and it can go a myriad of different directions by the end. Do you think Finality does lead to the start of another reality, or is Finality the end point of Star Rail's story? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you found this video entertaining, do consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and as usual, have a nice day.